A flurry of roster moves for the Bengals as despite having that 31st waiver priority, they add 3 players after cutdown day. Let's break it all down.
Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm Jake Liscow. He's James Rapien. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your Cincinnati Bengals every day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Thanks for making us your first listen, and to all of you who subscribe on YouTube and follow anywhere you get your podcast. James, a flurry of roster moves, as I mentioned at the top of the show. Plenty to break down today, as there are players arriving on the Bengals 53-man roster, players departing, some temporarily, some maybe a little bit more permanently from the Bengals 53-man roster. I think most of them will be back in some way, shape, or form. One fan favorite departs, and another fan favorite, or Marvin Lewis favorite, front office favorite of the Cincinnati Bengals, visits with the Bengals. So plenty.
Marvin
get
smiled on Wednesday. Marvin was smiling on Wednesday morning. He was like, "Oh, I could hear him now from Arizona." That dude woke up in Arizona all excited. You go ahead. We'll get to OJ Howard later.
I woke up excited because that news broke well before I woke up. Like 3 hours before I woke up this morning.
It was 7:40 something in the morning.
Yeah.
I was getting my Built Bar lift on, and of course, I'm like, guess I'm skipping cardio today. And I sprinted to my car and we got to work,
Yeah. And I was still asleep because that's 4 a.m. out where I live. The Bengals add 3 players in the cut downs. And, I think they're a little bit surprised. They're saying, Zach Taylor said, actually, they're 3 players we really liked. We didn't necessarily think we would get them. And the 3 players are, on the offensive side of the ball, Max Scharping, who, going back to the 2019 draft when he was a second-round pick by the Houston Texans, was one of the top tackles on the Joe Goodberry, Jake Liscow draft board at the time. Not graded significantly, a little bit, but not a ton worse than Jonah Williams at the time. They were close, and that's grading at tackle. He was an athletic tester for a tackle and has played guard for the most part, but has some versatility since coming to the NFL. Devin Asiasi, tight end from the New England Patriots, their 3rd-round pick in 2020 out of UCLA. Massive player at tight end. Listed at 280 from what I've seen. And finally, Jay Tufele, a draft Twitter favorite, as I recall, in last year's draft when he was a 4th-round selection by the Jacksonville Jaguars. He only got into 4 games for the Jaguars in 2021, not including against Cincinnati. So this isn't one of those instances where he had a nice game against the Bengals and then the Bengals came out and signed him a year later. But listed at 305, lined up for the Jaguars, mostly at non-nose tackle alignments. So this suggests that this is a backup to BJ Hill, potentially a versatile piece, though, as well. And we'll see where he fits in. I think I'm excited to see how his pass rush looks. And, Zach Taylor talked about this, James. They were light on the defensive interior, and this helps.
It does. And you were on this too. You talked about defensive tackle really, on and off throughout the preseason and training camp. And so you get a guy in Jay Tufele who, well, let's back up. All 3 of these guys, this coaching staff, this front office together got to evaluate. In 2019 for Scharping, that was Zach Taylor's first year here, but you're literally talking about the main staff, the coordinators, most of these assistants, not all of them, most of them, and Duke Tobin and company, they all evaluated these guys during the pre-draft process. So I do think that helps. It's not like, we're talking about 2017, right, in OJ Howard, for example. That said, Tufele gives them, another guy to play the defensive tackle spot, a guy they evaluated last year, clearly liked. And much like we talked about, and by the way, I need to stick my foot in my mouth because the Bears actually claimed Alex Leatherwood, but it was a dumpster fire in Jacksonville last year. I don't know what Jay Tufele is because it was a dumpster fire. So to me, great. You get this guy that you liked in the draft that you were probably willing to spend a draft pick on. And instead of doing that, you get him a year later and you just hope he didn't develop many bad habits, right? As far as the other two, Max Scharping, that's a guy that you're right. You guys talked about, way back when, mentioned him on Wednesday's show. And I'm glad they were able to get someone like this, someone who had 33 starts, appeared in 48 games, has been on, a winning team. Has he 2019 Houston? Yeah, that was a winning team. So yeah, I think that adding someone like that to be not a starter, Cordell Volson, by the way, named starting left guard, breaking, shocking news to Locked On Bengals listeners. He's not going to be a starter, but he gives you someone that's been there, done that if Alex Kappa gets nicked up for a game or a drive or half a series, same thing with Cordell Volson. So I really like that addition. And Asiasi, here's what I think Asiasi is, to be honest with you. And the Bengals list him at 260, by the way, even though that could be off. Who knows, right? But listed as 260, 6'3", 260. He's not Hayden Hurst's backup. He's Drew Samples. He's this dude who can block and get movement and all of those things. So if Sample isn't ready for week 1, I think he's going to be, or if they need an extra blocker or anything like that, now you got a guy that can do that. And yeah, he caught a couple passes and had a touchdown for New England, but I don't think that's how he's going to be used. It's going to be, all right, we have someone else besides Drew Sample that can block and block at a high level at the tight end position.
Yeah, you look at his historical use in New England. He has a total of 224 snaps in his Patriots career, 224 snaps in his Patriots career, and 136 of those were blocking snaps of some sort. Most of them run blocking. That is how Bill Belichick saw Devin Asiasi, and then they signed a couple tight ends, and there wasn't really a roster spot for their third-round pick. Scharping, I think, is the one that I'm most excited about in this group, but I do see that all three of these guys could easily be on the active game day roster in week 1. Scharping could easily be the backup interior offensive lineman at that point in time. It wouldn't shock me at all to see him beat out Jackson Carman in that role. He has had a bit of an up and down career for sure, but Houston, I mean, you talk about organizations that are poorly run. Houston, Jacksonville, certainly near the top of that list. And so you might be thinking, well, what are the Bengals doing claiming players that couldn't even make those teams? And I think, James, you kind of talked about it. You go back to the pre-draft evaluation on these guys, which Frank Pollock certainly had from his previous time with the Bengals, right, in 2019?
He was not up with the Bengals. He was with the Bengals in 2018.
Yeah, 1 year off. Okay, my bad. So either way, he's evaluating linemen at the time, has an opinion, and Scharping, a guy that we thought highly of back then, and they have a pre-draft opinion on Tufele too. So they see these guys, they see roster needs, and these moves make a lot of sense to bring balance back to the roster. And you might be looking at it and saying, well, they're really heavy at offensive line right now. There are 11 offensive linemen on this roster right now. I think that's going to change. There are going to be more corresponding moves. So to make room for these guys, the Bengals released Brandon Allen, who will be back. They released Mike Thomas, the safety. I think he'll also be back. And they waived Travion Williams, who could also be back, but probably would be on the practice squad if he goes unclaimed. So more roster gymnastics to come, James, and I think we can talk about those coming up next, because what about OJ Howard? What if they add him? What about Jesse Bates? What about these veterans that we just talked about who they want to get back on the roster? More moves coming for the Bengals. We'll break those down coming up next.
It's almost the start of the NFL season. You love this time of year. I love this time of year. That's why I'm recommending Elias Game Plan. The Elias Game Plan app is the only sports app from the most trusted name in sports stats, Elias Sports Bureau, the official statisticians of U.S. pro sports leagues, including the NFL. This app is a one-stop source for player news, league-validated player stats, team records, expert game analysis for betting, building your fantasy team, impressing friends. If you want to try to beat me in fantasy football, well, you're going to have to do it with the Elias Game Plan app, because otherwise I'm kicking your tail in fantasy. And Jake Liscow, that means you too. So with NFL season right around the corner, I mean, we're talking days now, just over a week away from Bengals Steelers. You got to download the Elias Game Plan app. And right now, I have a special offer for when you subscribe. Get a 14-day free trial off a monthly subscription plan, but only if you use promo code Locked On NFL. Again, a 14-day free trial of a monthly subscription plan. All you got to do is use promo code Locked On NFL. Find Elias Game Plan sports betting in the App Store or Play Store today, and use my promo code Locked On NFL.
More roster moves coming for the Cincinnati Bengals. It is inevitable. They want all three of those veterans that I just talked about, Mike Thomas, and Brandon Allen. I didn't stutter, both Mike Thomases. They want all those guys back on the roster. And in order to do so, there will be a number of, I think, injured reserve moves coming. And if OJ Howard joins the Bengals, there could be a player waived as well. What we saw on Wednesday is that Khalid Kareem and Taylor Britt still expected to go to IR, but Isaiah Prince didn't practice. James, you told me he was on the bike in street clothes. Mitchell Wilcox injured. Tyson Anderson on the rehab field. All these guys, potential IR candidates. If all five of those guys go to the IR, that would be the space they need to add. You can count 5 players here: Jesse Bates, Mike Thomas, Brandon Allen, and potentially OJ Howard. That is the quick and dirty explainer for the roster moves so far. And Ian Rapoport says that despite the Bengals being awarded Devin Asiasi off of waivers, he thinks that the Bengals still had it in their plans, at least as of midday on Wednesday. The Bengals still wanted to sign OJ Howard. What say you, James Rapien?
Well, a couple things. One, when that news came down and I discussed it on my channel and wrote about it and stuff, it's like, okay, well, OJ Howard makes some sense, right? He can block some, at least. And while he might not have the juice that he potentially had coming out of Alabama, can he be better than what they're maybe not even getting from a Mitch Wilcox, who's still coming back from that ankle sprain? Or maybe Drew Sample's worse than I realized, even though now we know that he practiced today, and I think he is progressing towards week 1. And so, you're certainly open to the possibility. And by the way, the Bills are paying him. So guess what? You're probably getting him at a league minimum type deal. Feel pretty good about it. But and think about all the moves that they had to make, right? Cutting Brandon Allen. He's coming back, for those that are thinking that Jake Browning stock is rising. Don't worry. He's coming back. Brandon Allen's going to be back. They've had to do all these different moves and tweaks just to get Asiasi on the roster, just to get these guys on the roster. Like, do you really think that they're in on another tight end? So now I go back and forth, and I respect Ian Rapoport and think that he's usually right and in the know, but just doesn't it feel weird now? Like, Devin Asiasi's here. He's a member of the Bengals. They still have Mitch Wilcox. Drew Sample practiced. Hayden Hurst is healthy. That's already 4. 5, so you're just cutting Wilcox? Maybe that's what they do, and they get Howard, but then where does he fit, right? I don't know if I see it right now. That being said, former first rounder, maybe they see something on film, but obviously you talk to some people in Buffalo, it's not like they were high on him, paying him to go. So now that Asiasi's in town, I lean towards no. Could it happen? Certainly could. I never say never, especially in this business. If they hadn't gotten him, then I think it changes everything. But the fact that they got a guy that they had, held in pretty high regard, I think, in the 2020 draft, a 3rd rounder, 91st overall pick by the Patriots, 2 years left on his deal. I think they feel pretty good about adding him to that room.
Yeah, and he fills a role. You talked about it earlier. He fills what they were looking for at the back of the tight end room. The only way I could see it still happening with Howard is if they do have spots to fill, right? If they do end up needing to put 5 guys on injured reserve, that leaves 1 spot. And it doesn't necessarily see. It could be Travion Williams coming back. It would be a little bit weird to waive him and then re-sign him. You don't often see that with guys that are subject to waivers. But if Khaled Kareem, Cam Taylor-Britt, Mitch Wilcox, Isaiah Prince, and Tyson Anderson, that's 5 guys. If they all need to go on the IR, then you're down to 52 on your 53-man roster. So there.
What if Tyson just doesn't go?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly something that could happen too, right? Like Isaiah Prince, Tyson Anderson, Mitchell Wilcox. Taylor didn't say they needed the IR. He said, in fact, on Wednesday that they're still evaluating where some of these guys need to go from an injury perspective.
And the other part is to keep in mind, you can only have 8 players
That's right.
on IR designated to return.
They don't have to designate them to return until they actually do return, but they can only bring 8 guys back. Yeah.
It's 8. So if you're saying like, oh, well, Wilcox is going to miss 4 weeks and then this guy, well, you know, at some point you're not going to do that. You're not going to want to do that at least. So that's the juggle, right? Isaiah Prince, they want him to play at some point this year. Do they put him on IR? Maybe, but then are they also doing that with a guy in Tyson Anderson who might not be as serious? And I don't know what he's dealing with. I will say this, by the way, what's weird, I talked to him after the game and like shook his hand and he was fine.
Yeah.
So maybe it was something afterwards that he didn't realize he had, or maybe it's not anything serious.
It could have been something that happened outside of the team too, away from the team, not necessarily something that was a game-related injury, practice-related injury. We don't really – no, it could have been a practice-related injury after the game. We don't really know. I guess they haven't really practiced.
They haven't practiced, no. So
never mind. Couldn't have been a practice-related injury. Yeah,
maybe it's not serious. Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe it's not serious.
The reason that I mentioned this is because Jeff Hodgson wrote about on Bengals.com Tyson Anderson as a potential IR candidate. So Hodgson also wrote that he might need the IR. It's not just that he missed practice.
And Butch has his ear on the ground always. So yeah, maybe he knows something that I don't. Look, it's been such a shuffle. Poker players would be lost in the shuffle right now. I mean, I'm going to have to go to the casino downtown Cincinnati and see if any of those dealers can keep up. I mean, there's been a lot going on, man. This has been a really eventful. I was in the locker room, and that's when they claimed those 3 dudes. It was like, oh snap! It's wild.
It's a very active day. Somebody asked me on Twitter, do you remember the Bengals ever being so active on cutdown day? And I'm sure they've had similar days to this in their history. Mm-hmm. I don't keep a good memory or index or reference of their cut down day claims historically, but it certainly feels very active. And I think it made the team better. I think that I don't know if we've said that yet, but going out there and adding depth at positions where we've said they need depth. Sharper. Jesus.
Scharping.
I get it. They needed interior offensive line depth. They needed interior defensive line depth. They needed tight end depth. The only position that we talked about them needing depth where they didn't make a move was corner.
Yep.
And so I do think that they made good claims here, even if these guys are just playing a handful of snaps this year, which is probably the hope for most of them, assuming the guys in front of them stay healthy. That's what you want.
And play well. Yep.
And play well, sure. It's providing challenge and depth at areas where, to me, it felt like the team really needed it. And that's why I like a lot of these moves.
No doubt. And so that, let's just tie OJ Howard in now. If you asked me this morning before you added Devin Asiasi, I'd say, yeah, he makes them better. Does he make them better now? And so that's a
good question. It still improves our depth. Like if they just have a roster spot, but you could use that roster spot elsewhere too.
And so, yeah, maybe they use that on the corner and they get another, maybe there's another move coming down that way. So it's fun. This is fun. And I like that they added an offensive lineman. I think of the 3, that's the most exciting one, and a big tight end that can block. I mean, in the run game, imagine lining him up on the right side, Devin Asiasi, and you got Lel Collins, Alex Kappa, and Asiasi just leading the way. What do you think?
They'll go two tight ends. Put Sample and Asiasi out there.
Oh,
go real heavy on the right side.
The Great Wall of Bengal. Yeah, the Great Wall of Bengal with Joe Mixon running behind it. Up next, we're going to dive into the practice squad because the Bengals, well, they added a lot of familiar faces to the practice squad, including a couple specialists. my favorite. We'll dive into that next right here on Locked On Bengals.
Are you one of those people who thinks it's okay to drive stoned? What's the worst that can happen, right? You end up driving below the speed limit. That's no big deal. The truth is, that's not true. Your reaction times slow way down when you're high, and you not only put yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Talk about a buzzkill. Stop killing yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, don't get behind the wheel. If you feel different, you drive different. Don't drive high. You'll get a DUI.
All right, let's keep things rolling with the Bengals practice squad, Jake. And the Bengals announced 13 of their 16 spots are taken up. And I'll just go through them real quick, and then we'll get a reaction and we'll discuss it. Long snapper Cal Adamitis ain't going anywhere, at least for the time being. He sticks around. So does quarterback Jake Browning, everybody's favorite backup. Drew Chrisman still in the organization. Devin Cochran, who I talked about, I thought they liked him a lot. He's still going to be with the team. Nate Gilliam, kind of an upset there. Nate Gilliam, to me, came in late and was able to beat out Desmond Noel for a practice squad spot. Dominique
Noel was waived injured, so he will revert to IR.
That's right.
He did revert to IR, in fact, on Wednesday after clearing waivers.
That's right. I forgot that because he injured. He had a high ankle.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So he had a pretty bad ankle sprain. That's right. Dominique Davis, the defensive tackle. Trent Irwin, I know some were worried about keeping him. Raymond Johnson III, Keandre Jones, Thaddeus Moss, Tegray Scales, Tyler Shelvin. I think that surprised some, but he's back. And only one of the two receivers that everybody wanted, Kwame Lassiter II. Man, I said I guaranteed 2 of 3. I was pretty confident in 3 of 3. And I want to get your reaction. Then I got to tell you my Kendrick Pryor story. Kendrick Pryor going to Jacksonville. But your reaction to those 13 guys.
Yeah, Kendrick Pryor. Ready to be on the practice squad. And alas, I mean, it's a bummer. I'm sure the Bengals are disappointed. I'm sure they wanted to keep him. Obviously, they wanted to keep him on the practice squad. I know there are a lot of Bengals fans that are disappointed, and he goes to the team picking at the top of the waiver priority in Jacksonville. My favorite part of the Kendrick Pryor thing, who I know you're going to share a story about, is Zach Taylor's quote that he talked about, Kendrick going down to Jacksonville. I just got off the phone yelling at my brother. Just got done yelling at my brother. I thought that was a pretty funny quote in his press conference. But keeping 2 specialists is interesting. Not necessarily surprising, but guys like Noah Spence, Trayvon Henderson are guys that I thought could come back to the practice squad. We'll see if Travion Williams, if he clears waivers, by the time you listen to this tomorrow, maybe that will have already happened, comes back to the practice squad in the future. And one other name that wasn't officially announced by the Bengals, but was reported, and so we'll see, is Nate Bowers, tight end, who has been undrafted with the Raiders for 3 years now, reportedly signed with the Bengals. He probably hasn't passed his physical yet. That could be why this hasn't been announced. It could have been an incorrect report as well. But Nate Bowers was the other name I wanted to throw out there that I also saw reported on Wednesday.
All right, so Kendrick Pryor.
Yeah.
Right? And I've interviewed Kendrick Pryor once after the Arizona game, talked to him one-on-one, really nice kid. So Joe Burrow finishes up in here in the room I'm sitting in and does his news conference. And then he walks out and the news breaks. I go in the locker room, the news breaks of the guys that they claimed. So I come in here, I write a quick story, and I'm going back in the locker room. And the door's locked. It's a security thing. The door's locked. And so someone needed to let me in. And I text a couple writers. No one had looked at their phone in time. And oddly enough, someone walks out. It's a player. And he's not that much taller than me. I've never stood up next to him. It was not that much taller. I'm like, oh, that's Kendrick Pryor. And he's on the phone. And he was like, yeah, I was going to sign, and I'm paraphrasing, but I was listening, I could hear him talking as he was just like, letting me in. And he was like, yeah, I was going to sign with the practice squad, but they told me I got claimed by Jacksonville. And so this guy was here. He was about to sign, and then he found out he was getting claimed by the Jacksonville Jaguars. Congrats to him. I mean, I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be on a 53-man roster. No doubt about it. I mean, he played great. He played as well as you could have imagined. If the day he signed as an undrafted free agent, you would have said, oh, this is how he's going to play in OTAs and this is how he's going to play in training camp, it would have been insane. So, that's the best case scenario. So congrats to him. But I thought it was just kind of hilarious how life comes at you fast. Like literally his agent's working on a flight for him. He was here to sign a practice squad deal, gets claimed. And I don't know if something didn't get tied together, but he's in the building and has to leave the building, clean out his locker, leave the building, and get on a plane to Jacksonville to get to work with the Jags.
That also happened with Devin Asiasi. He was in the building in New England, ready to sign his contract, and then they found out that he had been claimed, or he was informed that he had been claimed. So the waiver wire giveth and the waiver wire taketh.
Yeah. Here's what I would say, and our buddy Joe Goodberry put it pretty, and it made a lot of sense. If you would have said, all right, you can trade Kendrick Pryor for Max Scharping 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Would you? Everybody would do it. Oh, yeah. This guard that has started 33 games and it played in 48 and has all this experience and was pretty good, and versus a guy who isn't going to make your roster. So that's essentially what the Bengals did here. And
sort of.
I get it. You don't have to put it that way, but honestly, here's the thing: if he had made that 53-man cut, he would have gotten cut today. Like if he had made, he would have been, because he would have taken Travion Williams' spot probably, and then they would have had to find a way. Who knows? Maybe he would have made it through waivers this time around. You never know.
Yeah,
That's the crazy part.
That's kind of the gamble you take. A lot of the times you see guys get cut today on Wednesday after the first cut down. The teams are trying to kind of sneak. We're gonna protect him for an extra day. We're gonna let all these other moves happen. That'll make it practically harder for other teams to make that waiver claim if that's somebody they want. And you might see around the league that there are players being cut on Wednesday that you might be interested in the Bengals signing. One that really stood out to me, Amir Smith-Marset, was released by
Iowa.
the Minnesota Vikings.
You love him.
I do. People can go back to our draft videos before last year's draft. I was in on Amir Smith-Marset for day 3, and he returns. So if you're looking for a way for a wide receiver to be added to this roster, he needs to do something on special teams. And at least Smith-Marset returns kicks and punts as well. Maybe not particularly well so far in his NFL career, but he can do it. And has experience.
Well, anybody can do it.
Level. No,
anybody can do it.
In the NFL, he's done it. Just, he's a young player.
There you go.
Anyway, I'm in. Put the waiver claim in on Amir Smith-Marset.
Yeah. Hey, real quick before we get out of here, any scenario, you just mentioned that tight end on the practice squad. What if they just called OJ Howard and said, "Hey man, come sign on our practice squad. We don't have another."
Then you have 3 tight ends on the practice squad and 3 on the roster, and maybe Mitch Wilcox is somewhere.
3. Well, maybe you don't go with that other guy. You just keep Thad Moss and OJ Howard.
Maybe. I mean,
I don't know. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there.
Howard would do it. I assume he might Howard would have other suitors.
You think?
I assume.
I don't know.
Maybe not. I mean, if he doesn't, then the Bengals have made a huge mistake in trying to bring him in, right? You would hope that he has other suitors, that somebody thinks he can still play in the NFL besides just the Bengals.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know.
The Jets should probably bring him in because they don't have enough tight ends. They need more up there.
You know who needs more tight ends is the Baltimore Ravens. They have like 8 tight ends on their roster right now.
No receivers.
One receiver.
I like Rashad Bateman. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, Rashad. Just prove it this year. My dynasty team needs it.
Just the one. That's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. We've got one more episode coming for you this week. There will be some more roster moves. There will be some more practices. And then we're on to week 1. We get into our regular season groove, James. There's going to be a crossover coming next week. We're going to do
my God.
Everyone's favorite Pittsburgh Steelers.
Chris Carter ain't ready.
Bengals host. Chris Carter will be here.
Chris Carter ain't ready. He's going to be joining us from his sauna.
Yeah, he's moving. Fun fact.
Oh, anyway.
We'll be back tomorrow with more on your
I
Cincinnati
like Chris,
Bengals.
by the way.
Yeah, Chris is a good guy. As we gear up for this 2022 NFL season. Until next time, Bengals fans, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.